My name is Melinda Brooks. I'm 39 years old, a pediatric nurse by profession, and above all, a mother and a wife trying to hold together a family that often feels like it's unraveling at the seams. Every morning, I wake before the sun, long before the rest of the household stirs, to make sure things run smoothly, not just at the hospital where I work, but at home, where the real challenges wait. Being a nurse has taught me patience, empathy, and how to stay calm under pressure. But it's the kind of pressure I face at home that tests me in ways no hospital ward ever could. I juggle shifts that stretch into the late evenings, rushing from hospital corridors to soccer practices, and then back to the dinner table, where the roles I play change from nurse to mediator, negotiator, and sometimes emotional firefighter. At the core of this chaos is my husband Daniel, my daughter Emma, and his family, the Sanders, whom I've come to know as a force as demanding as any medical emergency. Daniel is a charismatic man with an easy smile and a way of lighting up a room when he walks in. But at family gatherings, something shifts. His warmth seems to retreat, replaced by a subtle coldness that I've been unable to fully articulate. It's in the way he speaks to me, or sometimes doesn't, when his parents and sister are around. The Brooks Sanders household isn't just our household. It's a minefield of unsaid rules and expectations, with me caught in the middle. If there is one thing I've learned, it's that family dinners are never just about the food or the casual catching up. They're battlegrounds where alliances are tested and quiet power plays unfold beneath polite smiles and carefully chosen words. As the new member of the Sanders family, I often find myself playing the role of peacekeeper, trying to smooth over the tension between Daniel and his family. I'm the one who notices the brief glances exchanged between his sister Karen and his mother Linda when I speak, the slight tightening of his father Richard's jaw when something I say doesn't align with their expectations. These moments start small, a dismissive comment here, a subtle eye roll there, but they accumulate like silent snowflakes, layering into a blizzard of discomfort that settles deep in my chest. I remind myself to keep my voice steady, to laugh at the jokes that sting, because I want to believe I'm part of this family, even if I'm often treated like an outsider. But it's the recent dinner that has been haunting me, the one where Daniel humiliated me in front of his family. It wasn't an explosive argument or a loud scene. It was much worse. It was a cold dismissal, a quiet cut that left me trembling, standing there like a ghost in the room. I felt every eye on me, the silence pressing down like a weight that made it hard to breathe. My hands shook and I wanted to disappear, but I couldn't. I was rooted in place, forced to endure the sting of rejection that wasn't just from Daniel, but echoed from the entire room. That night, as I lay awake, the laughter and whispered comments replayed in my mind like a cruel loop. I realized then that the fractures I've been trying to hide were deeper than I thought. It wasn't just about one bad evening. It was a pattern, a family dynamic that had been eroding my confidence for years. The truth was settling in. I was fighting for a place in a family that didn't fully want me. Despite all this, I have my daughter Emma. She's 12, smart beyond her years, and as sensitive as she is brave. She sits quietly at the edge of these gatherings, watching, absorbing the tension that no adult dares to acknowledge. I see the way she looks at me sometimes, eyes full of questions she doesn't know how to ask. She is my anchor and my reason to keep fighting, not just for acceptance, but for respect. This is where my story begins. A nurse, a mother, a mediator standing at a crossroads within her own family, shaken but not yet broken. The path ahead is uncertain, but I can feel the stirrings of something new inside me, a resolve to no longer be invisible, to no longer be the silent one who smiles through the pain. The journey ahead will test everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the courage it takes to stand up for yourself when those closest to you are the ones who cut the deepest. And so, with a shaky breath, I prepare to face what's next. From the very beginning of my marriage into the Sanders family, it was clear that I was entering a world where roles were rigidly defined, and the golden child shone in a way that left little room for anyone else to sparkle. That child was Karen, my husband Daniel's sister, a woman who seemed to carry the family's pride and expectations on her shoulders with an almost effortless grace. Where I was met with polite nods and tepid smiles, Karen was showered with warmth, constant attention, and an almost unspoken reverence from Richard and Linda Sanders, their parents. I remember those early days vividly. At the first holiday dinners I attended as Daniel's wife, Karen was the center of stories, the bearer of family news, and the one whose opinions were sought after and valued. Whenever she spoke, the room seemed to lean in, hanging on her every word. Meanwhile, I was often left on the periphery, listening, nodding, careful not to upset the delicate balance of a family dynamic that clearly had its favorites. Invitations to meaningful conversations were rare for me, and decisions about family matters seemed to unfold without my input, as if I were an invisible bystander rather than an integral part of the household. The exclusion wasn't always outright or malicious. Sometimes it came wrapped in what I was taught to interpret as tradition or family ways. For instance, when it came time to plan family vacations or major celebrations, Karen's preferences were prioritized, while my suggestions were met with gentle deflections or vague promises of consideration that never materialized. I learned quickly that my role was to support and adapt, to blend in quietly rather than assert myself. Over time, I noticed how the parents, Richard and Linda, would compare me to Karen in subtle but unmistakable ways. A compliment to Karen's career achievements was often followed by a backhanded remark about my nursing job. Phrases like, "It's not exactly a high-powered position," or, "At least Karen is making strides in the corporate world," slipped casually into conversations meant to underscore a perceived hierarchy. These comments weren't always directed at me explicitly, but their sting was never lost. Even when I was doing my best to care for their aging parents or managing the household with precision, those efforts seemed to barely register beneath the shadow cast by Karen's accomplishments. I tried to rationalize their behavior in the beginning. Maybe it was a generational thing, I told myself, an old-fashioned mindset that valued certain professions and achievements over others. Maybe, I reasoned, it was just a misunderstanding, or the natural loyalty parents feel toward their daughter who had been in their lives longer than I had. I clung to the hope that with time, patience, and unwavering kindness, I would earn their acceptance, that they would see me as more than just the other woman in the family picture. But the cold politeness persisted. The warmth I longed for was reserved for Karen, whose every success was celebrated with pride, while mine was met with a quiet dismissal, or worse, an obliviousness that made me question whether my sacrifices mattered at all. Invitations to family events sometimes arrived late or after the plans were already set, with little effort made to include me in the decision-making. Even Daniel sometimes seemed to unconsciously echo their preferences, siding with Karen in disagreements or minimizing my feelings to keep the peace. These dynamics seeded a persistent ache inside me, a quiet loneliness amid a family that should have been my sanctuary. I learned to smile through the subtle slights, to accept their low-key exclusion as something I had to endure for the sake of harmony. But deep down, I felt the weight of being considered the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong despite sharing the same last name and the same life with Daniel. Karen herself wasn't always overtly hostile. More often, she carried an air of competitive superiority, a cool reserve that made it clear she guarded her position carefully. I sensed her resentment simmering beneath her smiles, especially in moments when Daniel's attention or his family's approval seemed to drift toward me. She was quick to remind me, subtly but unmistakably, of the boundaries I wasn't supposed to cross as the newcomer. Looking back, I realize how early and thoroughly these patterns were entrenched. It wasn't just about favoritism. It was about a family culture that favored tradition over change, appearances over authenticity, and loyalty over kindness. I tried to navigate this landscape with grace, telling myself that love and patience would eventually break down the walls. But the walls only seemed to grow higher, their foundations cemented by years of unspoken rules and expectations that left little room for someone like me to truly thrive. This quiet exclusion shaped much of my experience with the Sanders family. It was a slow erosion of confidence, a persistent reminder that no matter how much I gave or how hard I tried, I was always measured against a standard I could never quite meet, a standard embodied by Karen, the golden child who had been there all along, basking in the unchallenged glow of her family's favor. Over the years, I found myself giving far more than anyone seemed to notice or appreciate. It wasn't just about being a nurse or a mother. It was about stepping into the gaps left by others, filling roles that no one else appeared willing to take on in the Brooke Sanders household. My days blurred together in a relentless cycle of caregiving, managing, and adjusting, all while trying to keep the fragile peace that held my fractured family together. One of the most invisible yet exhausting parts of my life was caring for Daniel's aging parents. Richard had developed heart problems after his retirement, and Linda was battling early signs of dementia. The responsibility to monitor their medications, schedule doctor's appointments, and ensure they followed through with treatment plans fell primarily to me. I rearranged my nursing shifts to be home in the evenings when their needs often spiked. Weekends became filled with errands, picking up prescriptions, accompanying them to tests, and handling household chores they could no longer manage on their own. I remember countless mornings waking before dawn, not to prepare for my hospital shifts, but to get Richard's blood pressure machine ready, reminding Linda gently to eat breakfast or take her pills. I became the silent guardian of their health, a role that required patience and compassion, but also came with deep exhaustion that no one outside the house seemed to recognize. Daniel's parents rarely expressed gratitude. Their acceptance felt more like an expectation, something owed to them rather than a gift I willingly gave. At home, I took on the complex task of managing our household finances. Daniel's work kept him traveling or buried in meetings, and his parents' finances were intertwined with ours because of the family business. I balanced bills, negotiated with service providers, and kept meticulous records, often staying up late after Emma was asleep to ensure every payment was accounted for. It was a juggling act, trying to maintain order amid a swirl of expenses, insurance claims, and medical bills for the Sanders. I absorbed the stress silently, knowing that if I faltered, the entire household system would wobble. To accommodate these responsibilities, I had to make personal sacrifices. When a promotion opportunity came at the hospital, one that could have advanced my career and increased our family's income, I declined. The timing conflicted with a critical period when Linda's dementia symptoms worsened, and Daniel's parents required constant oversight. It felt like the right choice then, putting family first. But in hindsight, I wonder if that decision marked the point where my ambitions were quietly sidelined. Daniel's support, when it came, was inconsistent. At times, he acknowledged my efforts with a nod or a brief, "Thank you," but often he seemed to take for granted the invisible labor I performed. When tensions flared between me and his family, he sometimes distanced himself, choosing the path of least resistance. He would tell me, "It's just family stuff, Melinda. Don't take it so hard," as if my pain was insignificant compared to maintaining a facade of harmony. Emma, our daughter, grew up absorbing this tension like a sponge. I noticed her becoming quieter at family gatherings, withdrawing into herself. She would sit at the edge of the room, clutching her tablet, eyes flickering between Daniel's tense expressions and the subtle barbs exchanged across the dinner table. Once, after a particularly strained visit, she asked me in a whisper, "Mom, why do they never say anything nice about you?" Her words cut deeper than any argument. Even at 12, she sensed the imbalance, the lack of warmth that should have been natural in family love. Despite everything, I held on to hope that if I kept giving, kept bending, kept smiling despite the bruises to my heart, something would change. I believed that family meant more than blood, that my efforts would eventually break through the coldness, that Daniel's family would see me not as an outsider, but as a true part of the family. I clung to this belief even as the weight of their indifference pressed down harder with each passing year. In those years, my identity became tied to the role of caregiver, peacekeeper, and silent supporter. I became the one who adjusted her life to fit around others, who carried burdens without complaint, who absorbed slights meant to undermine my worth. I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, but I was still there, holding the pieces together, hoping that someday the fragile threads of acceptance and respect would replace the cracks and cold silences. Yet beneath that hope was a growing ache, a quiet realization that the sacrifices I made, the countless acts of care and compromise, were not enough in a family that measured value in favoritism and appearances. The more I gave, the more invisible I seemed to become. And as Emma watched and learned, I wondered how long I could protect her from the same wounds I was beginning to understand were deeper and more permanent than I had ever imagined. The holiday dinner that year was supposed to be a warm occasion, an opportunity to set aside the undercurrents of tension that so often simmered beneath the surface of our family gatherings. The house was decked out with twinkling lights and festive garlands, the smell of pine and baked goods mingling in the air. I had spent hours in the kitchen, carefully preparing the meal. It wasn't a grand feast worthy of a magazine cover, but it was made with intention and love, a collection of tried and true recipes I hoped would bring a little joy to the night. I remember standing by the stove, carefully basting the turkey, while Daniel hovered nearby, chatting with his sister Karen and his parents, Richard and Linda. The laughter and light-hearted chatter filled the rooms, but I had learned over time that appearances could be deceiving. Even amid the noise and smiles, the sharp edges of judgment often lurked just beneath the surface. Still, I told myself to enjoy the moment, to believe, if only briefly, in the possibility of belonging. As the food was brought to the table, the family gathered around, plates piled with my cooking. I took a deep breath, watching as Daniel took his first bite. For a moment, he said nothing, and I dared to hope he might offer a word of praise. Instead, in front of everyone, he let out a slow, deliberate sigh. "Well," Daniel said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "I guess we can't all have Karen's gourmet skills." The room fell into a brief silence before a few chuckles escaped from Richard, who gave a low chuckle behind his hand. Linda rolled her eyes, but didn't say anything, as if to avoid escalating the moment. Karen smirked, her eyes flickering in my direction like a silent challenge. The air shifted, and I felt every head turn toward me, the weight of their gazes settling like a cold stone in my stomach. My cheeks burned, a flush of humiliation rising that no amount of practiced composure could fully mask. I forced a smile, trying to laugh it off as though Daniel's jab was no more than a harmless joke, but inside, the sting was sharp and immediate. It wasn't just the insult itself. It was the way he had chosen to dish it out in front of his family, where my vulnerabilities were laid bare without warning. I wanted to say something, to defend the hours I had spent cooking, to remind him quietly that this meal was my effort to bring us all together, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with the familiar ache of invisibility. Instead, I looked down at my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling the tremble beneath my skin. Later, when Daniel and I found a quiet moment away from the others, I tried to express how his comment had made me feel. His response was casual, dismissive even, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "You're too sensitive, Melinda. It was just a joke," he said with a shrug. "Don't make a big deal out of nothing." That phrase haunted me. Just a joke. It was a defense mechanism, a way to minimize the impact of his words and shift the blame onto me for reacting at all. But for me, it was more than that. It was a moment when the lines between family and outsider blurred painfully clear. As the dinner continued, the laughter and conversation resumed, but I felt like I was standing on the outside of a glass wall, visible, but untouchable. The subtle exchanges between Daniel and his family resumed their usual dance of approval and dismissal, and my role as the silent scapegoat was sealed once more. The incident wasn't explosive or dramatic enough to demand an intervention, but the damage it did was lasting. It planted a seed of doubt inside me, a quiet voice that whispered I might never truly be accepted, no matter how much I tried. And as I looked across the table at Emma, who sat quietly clutching her tablet, I saw reflected in her eyes the same confusion and hurt that was settling in my own heart. That night, as the house grew still and I lay awake listening to the distant hum of the city outside, I realized something fundamental. The fractures beneath our family's surface were deeper than I had allowed myself to see. Daniel's sarcastic dismissal was not an isolated slip. It was part of a pattern, a subtle, relentless erosion of respect that chipped away at my confidence and my sense of belonging. I understood then that these moments, small and sharp as they were, carried the weight of years of exclusion and comparison. I had been fighting for a place at this table for a long time, but this night crystallized the painful truth that being a part of this family might require more than my patience and kindness. It might require a confrontation I wasn't ready for yet, but which was becoming impossible to avoid. The warmth of the holiday decorations could not mask the chill that had settled over me, and as the last of the dishes were cleared away, I sat quietly, feeling the weight of the evening pressing down, a weight that would follow me, quiet but heavy, into the days that lay ahead. The room buzzed with the usual chatter, the clinking of silverware, and the low hum of casual family talk. It was another one of those dinners where the surface seemed calm, but the currents beneath were anything but. The table was set beautifully, crystal glasses catching the soft glow of the chandelier, napkins folded just so. Everyone was there: Daniel's parents, Richard and Linda, his sister Karen, who sat with an effortless ease as if the space was hers by birthright, Daniel himself, smiling politely but with an edge I had come to recognize. And then there was me, squeezed between the polite smiles and subtle glances, trying to disappear into the chair, hoping no one would notice the tremor in my hands. The conversation had been light at first. Weather, work, Emma's school achievements. But I knew how quickly the tone could shift. I felt it almost like a warning, a tightening in the air. Daniel, always the master of that delicate balance between charm and control, steered the talk toward careers. It was a topic that often became a minefield for me, one where my nursing job was inevitably diminished by comparison. "And what about you, Melinda?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying an almost theatrical casualness. "Still babysitting children all day, huh? Must be so fulfilling." The words hit me like a cold slap. I forced myself to meet his gaze, but I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the sting of humiliation burning behind my eyes. The others looked on, some with thinly veiled smirks, others with polite, strained expressions. Karen's eyes flicked toward me, sharp and calculating, as if daring me to respond. Richard shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, while Linda's smile tightened, almost brittle. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend the countless nights I had spent on call, the babies I had comforted through fevers and tears, the exhausted parents I had reassured. I wanted to remind them of every early morning, every late shift, every sacrifice I'd made to keep this family functioning. But before a word could escape, Daniel cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Come on, Melinda," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "It's not exactly a high-powered job, is it? Karen's out there closing deals, making real money, building a career that matters." The room grew quieter, the words hanging heavy between us like a challenge. I felt a sudden, piercing awareness of how small I was being made to feel, not just by Daniel, but by the entire family. I wasn't just being compared, I was being erased, my accomplishments reduced to trivialities in front of the people who should have been my support. Emma shifted beside me, clutching her tablet tightly. I caught her eyes out of the corner of mine, wide, watching, silently absorbing the scene. Her presence was a balm, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this moment of public dismissal. Summoning every ounce of composure, I tried once more, quietly. "I'm proud of my work, Daniel. It's important to me." But he smiled, not kindly, more like a predator toying with its prey. "Sure, Melinda, if you say so." A nervous chuckle escaped from Richard, and Linda's eyes darted away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Karen smirked again, the unspoken message clear: "You don't belong here." I felt my throat tighten, the familiar ache of being misunderstood and undervalued settling deep inside me. The laughter, the polite nods, the quiet judgments, all of it coalesced into a moment that left me shaking silently in my seat. And then, from across the table, Emma did something that stopped the room cold. She lifted her tablet high, the screen glowing in the dim light, displaying a video. It was a clip from a few weeks earlier, a recording she had taken secretly, of Daniel making the same belittling remarks about my career, the same dismissive tone. The camera caught his smirk, the sneer in his voice, the way he minimized me like a joke. The room fell utterly silent. The air thickened with shock and disbelief. Daniel's face drained of color, the confident mask cracking to reveal a flicker of terror. He looked from the screen to me, and back to the stunned faces around the table, unable to find a foothold in the truth Emma had laid bare. For the first time in a long time, I felt a shift, not just in the room, but within myself. The humiliation was still there, sharp and raw, but beneath it was a rising tide of clarity. The pattern I had tried to dismiss was now undeniable, caught on camera and illuminated for all to see. My daughter's quiet courage had pierced the veil of silence and denial that had protected Daniel's dismissiveness for far too long. I sat back, hands still trembling, heart pounding, not from fear, but from a new, fragile hope. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, as everyone waited for Daniel's next move. But he had no words to offer, no excuses left that could mask the truth now glowing on that screen. And in the stillness, I realized this was a moment that could no longer be ignored. The family's unspoken rules had been broken, and something fundamental was about to change. In the quiet aftermath of that dinner, the house felt colder somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and now held it tight in their shadows. I sat alone in our dimly lit living room, the soft hum of the night outside unable to soothe the ache inside me. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair, knuckles whitening, as the events replayed over and over in my mind. Daniel's cutting words, the stunned silence from his family, Emma's brave act with her tablet. It was like watching a slow-motion film of a wound opening wider with each pass. For years, I had tried to rationalize the dismissals, the half-smiles that never quite reached the eyes, the comparisons that always left me coming up short. I told myself it was all harmless teasing, a form of family banter, a way to keep things light even when undercurrents ran deep. But now, sitting in the stillness, it was impossible to ignore the truth I had buried so deeply beneath layers of hope and denial. This wasn't banter. It was belittlement disguised as casual conversation, a relentless pattern meant to chip away at my confidence and my place within this family. The grief came first, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. It wasn't just the humiliation in front of Daniel's parents and sister. It was the years of small cuts and quiet exclusions accumulating into a sharp, aching loneliness. I mourned the family I had hoped for, the acceptance I had longed to earn with every effort and sacrifice. There was a hollow space inside me where trust should have lived, a space slowly hollowed out by laughter that was never quite kind, compliments that were backhanded, and support that was conditional at best. But grief is a complicated companion, and as the hours turned into days, it began to morph. That heavy sadness gave way to something hotter, fiercer, anger at the injustice of it all. At the way I had been used as a convenient scapegoat, the silent punching bag who absorbed blame so others could shine. Anger at Daniel, whose smile had once been a refuge, but who had now become a source of pain, his words cutting deeper than any stranger's. Anger at the Sanders family for their cruel favoritism, their unwillingness to see beyond their narrow definitions of worth and success. I recognized the pattern for what it was, a toxic cycle that demanded my silence and sacrifice in the name of family first. But whose family? And at what cost? The mantra, repeated so often by Daniel and his parents, felt like a cage closing around me, trapping me in a role that erased my identity and my dignity. I had been told to endure, to keep the peace, to smile through the pain. But enduring had become exhaustion, peace had become submission, and smiling felt like a lie. Emma's presence in all this was a bittersweet reminder of what was at stake. I thought of her sitting quietly next to me during that dinner, her eyes wide but silent, her tablet poised like a shield. She absorbed the tension I tried so hard to hide, feeling the undercurrents of disdain and dismissal that adults pretended weren't there. My heart ached for her, to protect her from these wounds, to spare her the loneliness of feeling unseen and unheard. But how could I, when I myself was just beginning to understand the depths of the hurt? This moment, this painful clarity, was a turning point. I realized that staying silent, pretending everything was fine, would only allow the pattern to continue. The invisible boundaries that kept me on the outskirts had to be challenged, if not for me, then for Emma. I owed her a future where respect wasn't conditional, where family loyalty wasn't a weapon used to silence. I owed myself the courage to reclaim my voice, even if it trembled. So, as the night deepened, I made a quiet promise to myself, a resolve that this pattern of humiliation and exclusion would not be my story's end. The path ahead was uncertain and daunting, but it held the possibility of change. I would no longer be the silent one, the invisible one, the scapegoat. I would find a way to break free from the toxic ties that bound me, to protect Emma, and to rediscover the strength that had been quietly growing inside me all along. And with that fragile hope flickering to life, I closed my eyes, knowing that the days to come would demand everything I had, and then some. In the days following that shattering dinner, a quiet fire began to kindle within me. I knew that hoping for change through patience and silent endurance had led me nowhere. The time had come to take control, to protect not only myself, but my daughter Emma. But change, real change, required more than just resolve. It demanded preparation, strategy, and a clear-eyed view of the reality I faced. I needed to arm myself with facts and evidence, not just feelings and memories that could be dismissed as subjective or emotional. So I started keeping track. It began with the disrespect, the snide comments, the dismissals, the subtle undermining that had become routine. I had always tried to brush these moments off, telling myself they were trivial, that love and family meant overlooking flaws. But now, I realized these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a cycle woven into the very fabric of my life with Daniel and the Sanders family. Every cruel word, every slight, was a thread in that pattern, and I needed to document them all. I opened a discreet folder on my laptop, titled it simply Family Issues, and began gathering texts, emails, and notes. I copied conversations where Daniel had minimized my work, or where his mother and sister had made passing, disparaging remarks about my role in the family or my nursing career. Some messages were casual, almost innocent at first glance. Comments like, "Melinda doesn't really understand the business world," or "Karen's achievements are on another level." But when pieced together, they formed a damning mosaic of exclusion and disdain. One of the most painful realizations was how often these comments came cloaked in humor or concern, making it hard to challenge them in the moment. Daniel's dismissive phrase, "It's just family stuff," echoed in my mind as I sifted through the evidence. But now, with this collection in front of me, I could no longer ignore the pattern or let it be minimized. Alongside the verbal and written slights, I turned my attention to the financial side of things. Managing the household budget had always been my responsibility, but the intertwining of our personal finances with the Sanders family business complicated matters. I spent hours poring over bank statements, bills, and shared account records, searching for anomalies or inconsistencies. There were payments that didn't add up, transfers that seemed unusual, and expenses that were never fully explained. Daniel's parents were trusting him, and by extension me as his wife, to keep things in order. But I began to suspect that trust hadn't always been justified. Late into the nights, I cross-referenced invoices with receipts and questioned every irregularity. I tracked down emails about certain expenditures and noted the vague or evasive responses from Daniel when I asked for clarification. Each discovery chipped away at the illusion that everything was running smoothly behind the scenes. It was exhausting work, demanding a level of vigilance I hadn't anticipated needing to summon in my own home. Recognizing I needed expert advice, I reached out to a trusted attorney, someone I had known through a nurse support group who specialized in family law and financial rights. I kept the consultations discreet, speaking in hushed tones about the complexities of shared assets, legal protections, and the steps necessary to safeguard my interests and those of Emma. The lawyer explained my rights clearly. As Daniel's wife and Emma's mother, I was entitled to transparency and respect in all financial dealings, and I could take action if those boundaries were violated. This knowledge was empowering. It transformed my anger and grief into practical resolve. I began drafting a plan, mapping out how to reclaim control without igniting immediate confrontation. I knew that a direct challenge too soon could fracture the fragile peace and potentially harm Emma's stability. So I resolved to keep my intentions hidden for now, maintaining a calm exterior, even as I quietly gathered evidence and fortified my position. In the midst of this, I reflected on the reality that the Sanders family relied heavily on my caregiving and household management. They depended on me to fill gaps that no one else seemed willing to address. This dependence was a lever I could use, not as a weapon, but as a source of strength to demand the respect and fairness I deserved. I realized that withdrawing or renegotiating my involvement would force a reckoning, one that might finally expose the unspoken dynamics that had kept me marginalized for so long. Throughout this process, I kept Emma close, mindful of how much she had absorbed and how deeply these tensions affected her. I reassured her with quiet conversations about fairness and self-worth, promising that things would get better, that we would face this challenge together. Her eyes, bright and determined, were a reminder that my fight was not just for myself, but for the future of our little family. So, in this delicate balance of patience and planning, I prepared to step into a new chapter, one where silence would no longer be my shield, and invisibility no longer my refuge. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer willing to be sidelined. The quiet documentation, the legal counsel, the thoughtful strategizing were my first acts of reclaiming agency in a family that had long tried to diminish me. And as the days passed, I felt a growing strength beneath the surface, a quiet determination that would not be easily broken. In the weeks that followed my decision to no longer be the silent victim, I started to create space for myself in ways that felt both small and significant. It wasn't a dramatic withdrawal, but rather a subtle pulling back, a quiet reclaiming of boundaries I hadn't realized I'd long sacrificed. The first step was gently declining the unpaid caregiving tasks that had become routine. No more driving Richard to yet another specialist appointment on a Saturday morning. No more last-minute runs for medication pickups that threw off my carefully scheduled shifts at the hospital. I began to say no politely but firmly. I remember the tight knot in my stomach the first time I did it. Linda called one Friday evening, her voice shaky and uncertain, asking if I could take her to a memory clinic appointment the next day. Normally, I would have rearranged my schedule without hesitation. But this time, I hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry, Linda. I have a double shift at the hospital. Maybe Karen can help this weekend?" The pause on the other end was telling, a mix of surprise and disappointment, though she didn't protest further. It felt like a small victory, a tentative assertion of my own needs. Similarly, when Richard asked if I could help organize the house before an upcoming family event, I offered a gentle refusal. "I've got some overtime coming up, and I need to focus on that right now," I explained. The usual assumption that I would drop everything for their convenience began to unravel. Even Daniel noticed the change, though he said nothing directly. His sideways glances spoke volumes, perhaps a mixture of confusion and unease at my shifting priorities. Meanwhile, I tightened my grip on the household finances. Managing our shared accounts had always been my responsibility, but previously, Daniel had unfettered access to passwords and online portals. Now, after careful thought, I changed the passwords and limited his ability to make impulsive or untracked transactions. It was a protective measure more than a power play, a way to ensure greater transparency and control. I knew it might ruffle feathers, but I felt it was necessary. At work, I increased my shifts, volunteering for additional hours. It wasn't just about earning more money. It was about carving out a space where I felt valued and respected, away from the emotional minefield of home. The hospital was challenging, no doubt, but there I was recognized for my skills and dedication. It became a refuge, a place where my worth wasn't questioned or diminished. Emma responded to these changes with a cautious optimism. I noticed her sitting up straighter. The same girl who once shrank into corners now seemed to draw strength from my quiet resolve. At family gatherings, she began to speak up more, albeit softly, no longer just a silent observer clutching her tablet. Her growing confidence was a balm to my soul, a sign that my efforts were not unnoticed by the one person whose opinion mattered most. The Sanders family, however, seemed unsettled by my newfound composure. The usual undercurrent of expectation, of me being always available and accommodating, shifted into a subtle tension. Karen's eyes narrowed on me at the next family dinner, her smile tight and unreadable. Richard's polite nods felt cooler, less forgiving. Linda's casual requests diminished. It was as if the invisible leash I had worn for years had suddenly been clipped, and the family was unsure how to respond. Daniel's demeanor was perhaps the most telling. He seemed disoriented, caught between loyalty to his parents and the growing distance between us. Sometimes I caught him watching me with a mixture of frustration and something I couldn't quite place, maybe fear or guilt. But when I tried to discuss these changes, he would brush it off with a casual, "It's just stress, Melinda," or "We'll figure it out." His words rang hollow. Inside, I knew this was only the beginning. My quiet withdrawal was a ripple in the carefully maintained family dynamics, a disturbance that would force confrontation sooner or later. But for now, the calm surface of my polite refusals and controlled finances masked a growing strength beneath. I was no longer the invisible caretaker bending to every whim. I was asserting myself, reclaiming my space. And as I held Emma's hand tightly after one particularly tense weekend visit, I realized that this shift was about more than just me. It was about protecting her from the scars I had carried too long, about showing her that respect is not something you beg for, it's something you demand. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to walk it on my own terms. The next family meeting was scheduled by Richard and Linda, ostensibly to discuss upcoming plans for the holidays and the family business. But I knew, deep down, it was going to be more than that. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for months was impossible to ignore now. I arrived early, my palms sweating slightly, the carefully documented notes and financial records tucked securely in my bag. Emma was with me, sitting quietly beside me, her tablet in hand, her steady presence a silent bolster to my resolve. The room was the same familiar setting, the Sanders living room with its polished mahogany furniture, the walls adorned with framed photos of family milestones and smiling faces that seemed to mock the undercurrents swirling beneath. Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, while Linda busied herself arranging refreshments with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Karen was already there, seated with the ease of someone who believes this space is hers by right, her sharp gaze flicking toward me as I took my seat. Daniel entered last, offering a polite nod but avoiding eye contact. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and as the meeting began, I felt the weight of every glance cast my way. But I was no longer the trembling, silent woman from previous dinners. Beneath my calm exterior, a fierce determination had taken root. When the initial small talk petered out, I cleared my throat and spoke, my voice steady but firm. I want to start by saying that I care deeply about this family and have always tried to support us all in every way I can. I began, scanning the faces around the table. But I need to be clear about where I stand now. I will no longer provide financial or caregiving support to this family without formal agreements and mutual respect. A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Karen's smirk faltered, and Linda's fingers tightened around her napkin. Richard's brow furrowed as he exchanged a quick look with Daniel, who finally met my gaze with a flicker of uncertainty. I took a breath and continued. For years, I have managed medical appointments, household finances, and supported the family business behind the scenes, often without acknowledgement. But the pattern of disrespect and disregard can't continue. From my bag, I retrieved a neatly organized binder and placed it on the table. Here is documentation of financial transactions that have been mishandled, as well as records of disrespectful remarks and behaviors I have endured, not just from Daniel, but from members of this family. I watched as Linda's face tightened, Karen's eyes narrowed, and Richard leaned forward, clearly unsettled. Daniel looked like he was about to say something but hesitated. Emma, sitting beside me, held up her tablet briefly, the glow illuminating the evidence she had bravely shared weeks before. It was a silent reminder that the truth was no longer a secret. I pulled out another folder, this one containing legal documents. Additionally, I have taken steps to remove my name from the shared property deed and have consulted with an attorney to protect my rights and those of my daughter. The room fell into a stunned silence. The polished veneer of the Sanders family cracked, revealing the fragility beneath. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and Richard's usual authoritative composure faltered momentarily. "Melinda," Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "This isn't how we handle family matters." I met his eyes without flinching. "This is exactly how I have to handle them now, because silence and submission haven't worked. Respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of any family, and without it, I can't keep sacrificing myself." Linda cleared her throat, attempting to regain control. "We never intended to disrespect you, Melinda. Perhaps there have been misunderstandings." I shook my head gently. "This isn't about misunderstandings anymore. It's about boundaries. I'm willing to support this family, but there must be formal agreements, clear communication, respect, and fairness. Otherwise, I will step back, for my own well-being and Emma's." The tension hung palpably in the air, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Daniel's face was pale, the lines of tension unmistakable. Karen's usual confidence seemed shaken. For the first time, the family dynamic felt unbalanced, the scripts rewritten by my refusal to remain invisible. I felt a surge of quiet triumph, not because of confrontation, but because I was reclaiming my dignity and setting the terms for how I would be treated moving forward. Emma glanced up at me, eyes shining with pride, and I knew this was not just my victory, but hers as well. The meeting broke shortly after, the atmosphere heavy but charged with a possibility I hadn't dared to hope for before. As we left, the unsettled faces behind us told me that the status quo was no longer sustainable. My step toward boundaries had sent ripples through the family's carefully maintained facade, ripples that promised change, even if the road ahead remained uncertain. And as Emma and I walked out into the chilly evening air, hand in hand, I felt the first real weight lift from my shoulders. The hardest part wasn't over, but I was no longer standing alone in the shadows. I was ready to face whatever came next. The aftermath hit Richard and Linda Sanders like a sudden storm, catching them unprepared and unraveling the carefully maintained order they had long relied on. The unpaid medical bills began to pile up almost immediately. Without Melinda's meticulous oversight, routine payments slipped through the cracks. I could practically hear the tension crackling in the air during the phone calls and whispered conversations between Richard and Linda as they scrambled to figure out how to keep things afloat without the quiet force that had been holding their health care, and by extension their daily lives, together. The house, too, descended into chaos. Tasks that Melinda had seamlessly managed, the weekly cleaning schedules, organizing prescriptions, meal planning, and transportation to doctor visits, were suddenly left unclaimed. The quiet hum of order that had made their home feel safe and predictable was replaced by an unsettling shuffle of forgotten appointments and misplaced bills. The Sanders, who had taken Melinda's efforts for granted, now faced the stark reality of their dependence on her labor. Their reputation as attentive caretakers began to fray. Neighbors who had once admired their generosity and grace started whispering questions behind closed doors. How could a family so well-regarded suddenly appear so disorganized? The cracks in their polished facade were widening, and the buzz of gossip made the house feel smaller, more suffocating. In the midst of this, Richard and Linda turned to their son, Daniel, desperate for a solution. I overheard Linda's voice tremble with uncharacteristic vulnerability during a late-night call. "Daniel, you have to do something. Melinda's pulling away, and we're falling apart here." It was a plea wrapped in panic. Daniel found himself caught in the crossfire, his easy charm replaced by an uneasy tension. He called me one evening, voice strained, trying to mask the frustration boiling beneath. "Melinda, this has to stop. Your withdrawal is tearing the family apart. Can't you just help us get through this?" The tone was half plea, half demand. I stood my ground, feeling the weight of years of feeling unseen pressing down on me. I refused to revert to the silent caretaker role that had cost me so much. When Daniel suggested it was all just a phase, I countered firmly, "It's not a phase, Daniel. It's boundaries. I can't keep giving when I'm not respected or valued." Their attempts to manipulate the situation grew more blatant. Linda's phone calls turned into guilt-heavy monologues. "Emma is upset. Daniel says this is all your fault. Can't you see how hard this is for all of us?" The message was clear. I was responsible for the family's fractures. Daniel echoed this, casting blame subtly yet deliberately. suggesting Emma was the one stirring trouble by exposing truths that were better left buried. Karen, who had always resented any challenge to her place, grew visibly frustrated as Melinda's support waned. Her usual smile tightened into a scowl when she realized she could no longer rely on Melinda to smooth over difficulties or cover gaps in their caregiving and household management. I caught her once glaring at me during a family event, her eyes saying loud and clear, "This isn't how it's supposed to go." Others began noticing the shifting dynamics. Mutual friends and distant relatives whispered questions, sensing the tension yet unsure what lay beneath. The Sanders family's perfect image, long propped up by Melinda's quiet labor and emotional resilience, was cracking under the pressure. Behind closed doors, Daniel's denial intensified, his insistence that things could be fixed with a little patience starting to ring hollow. But through it all, I remained steadfast. I wouldn't be drawn back into old patterns of sacrifice and silence. Protecting Emma, keeping her safe from blame and hurt, became my North Star. I found strength in the truth and the quiet support of those who saw me clearly. The family could choose to adapt or fracture further, but I would no longer be the invisible force holding it all together at my own expense. The battle lines were drawn, and though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, I felt a new power rising within me, a determination to claim respect, to demand honesty, and to ensure that my family, however imperfect, would no longer be a place where humiliation and silence reigned. The withdrawal of my caregiving support hit the Sanders household like a sudden storm, uncovering just how much they had come to rely on me to keep their daily lives running smoothly. Almost immediately, unpaid medical bills began to accumulate. I wasn't there to make those calls, schedule follow-ups, or organize payments anymore. The usual rhythm I had maintained, meticulously managing everything to ensure no appointments were missed, medication doses weren't forgotten, and insurance claims were filed on time, was abruptly broken. I could almost hear the tension escalate in hushed conversations between Richard and Linda as they scrambled to handle their mounting responsibilities without the quiet force they had long taken for granted. Their home, once a place of steady order, began to unravel before my eyes. Tasks I had seamlessly woven into daily life, coordinating cleaning schedules, preparing nutritious meals, picking up prescriptions, driving to doctor visits, were suddenly left unclaimed. The house no longer hummed with the reassuring predictability I had carefully maintained. Instead, it echoed with the sounds of confusion and forgotten obligations. Pills were missed, appointments rescheduled or neglected, and the care that had seemed so effortless was now a glaring absence. It was painful to witness. The Sanders family, who had dismissed my efforts or barely acknowledged them, were now faced with the stark reality of their dependence on my labor and patience. Their polished image as attentive caretakers began to fray at the edges. Neighbors and family friends who once praised their grace and generosity started whispering behind doors, casting sideways glances that spoke of disarray and neglect. I heard rumors drifting through conversations. How could a family so respected suddenly appear so disorganized? What was going on behind those closed doors? In the midst of this unraveling, Richard and Linda turned desperately to Daniel. I overheard Linda's voice one evening, shaky and vulnerable in a phone call. "Daniel, this can't go on. Melinda's pulling away and everything's falling apart." There was panic woven into her words, a dependence on their son to right a ship that had been steering itself with my unseen hand for so long. Daniel's easy charm was replaced by an uneasy tension. His usual confident voice sounded strained when he called me, trying to mask frustration with a veneer of calm. "Melinda, please, this has to stop. Your withdrawal is tearing the family apart. Can't you just help us get through this rough patch?" His tone was a mixture of plea and expectation, as if I owed it to them to keep things from falling apart. But I stood firm, the exhaustion and hurt of years finally giving me the courage to say no. "Daniel, this isn't just a phase. These are boundaries I need to set for myself, for Emma, and for me. I can't keep giving when I'm not valued or respected." Their responses began to shift toward manipulation. Linda's phone calls became guilt-laden monologues, her voice heavy with heartbreak. "Emma's upset. Daniel says you're causing trouble. Can't you see how hard this is on all of us?" The subtext was clear. I was the source of the family's pain, the one undermining their fragile peace. Daniel echoed this blame, often insinuating that Emma's courageous stand and my refusal to stay silent were stirring drama, better left buried. Karen's reaction was the sharpest. With Melinda's withdrawal, Karen's carefully maintained role as the family's golden girl was threatened. At family gatherings, I caught her casting daggers with her eyes, her smile tight and forced. She made it clear without words that this was not how she expected things to unfold, and she resented the shift. Meanwhile, outsiders began noticing the crumbling facade. Family friends whispered in hushed tones, sensing the tension but uncertain about the cause. The Sanders family's image, once pristine and untouchable, was cracking. Behind closed doors, Daniel's denial intensified. He insisted things would smooth over with a little patience, but his words rang hollow, a mask over the growing discord. Through it all, I remained resolute. I refused to be pulled back into the exhausting cycle of sacrifice and silence. Protecting Emma's well-being became my guiding light, shielding her from the blame and hurt that had weighed so heavily on me. I found unexpected strength in the truth and in the quiet support of those who saw me clearly, not as a scapegoat, but as a woman reclaiming her dignity. The lines had been drawn. The Sanders family faced a choice: adapt and confront their flaws, or continue fracturing under the weight of their own denial. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with tension and unknown battles. But inside me, a new power was rising, a fierce determination to claim respect, insist on honesty, and ensure that my family, imperfect though it might be, would no longer be a place where humiliation and silence reigned unchecked. The days that followed our family meeting marked a turning point, not just for me, but for all of us. After laying down my conditions for how I would engage with the Sanders family moving forward, the atmosphere shifted in ways I hadn't dared fully imagine. It was no longer business as usual, no longer silent endurance or quiet submission. Instead, it became about setting new rules, firmly, clearly, and without apology. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening, Emma beside me, her small hands clutching a cup of tea as we talked quietly about what was to come. "Mom?" she said softly, looking up with those steady, bright eyes that always saw more than anyone else. "I'm proud of you. You're not letting them push us around anymore." Her words warmed me like a fire in the cold, a reminder that this fight was bigger than me. It was for her future, for the kind of family we deserved. I made it clear to Daniel that from now on, respect was the baseline of any interaction. No more dismissive remarks, no more minimization of my work or my worth. Shared responsibilities had to be honored, not just assumed. When I spoke, my voice carried the weight of years lived in the shadows, and it surprised me how quickly that weight translated into change. Daniel listened, sometimes reluctantly, at times with visible discomfort, but he listened, and that was the first step. We agreed to begin couples counseling, a space where the tangled emotions and buried resentments could be unpacked safely. Daniel admitted, haltingly at first, that he hadn't fully recognized how his words had hurt me. It was a fragile admission, but one I clung to as a sign that the walls we'd built might begin to crumble. Therapy felt like stepping into the unknown, but it was also a courageous step toward rebuilding, not just our marriage, but the family itself. On the practical front, I insisted on transparency and fairness. Financial matters would no longer be swept under the rug or handled without my input. Daniel and I set new boundaries around money, caregiving duties, and family events. The days of me taking on invisible burdens without acknowledgement were over. I was no longer a passive participant in the family's narrative. I was a voice they had to reckon with. The Sanders family, predictably, bristled at these changes. There were awkward silences at gatherings, subtle digs here and there, but I stood firm, refusing to be pulled back into old patterns. Daniel's parents, once dismissive, began to see that their daughter-in-law was no longer the woman who would quietly absorb their slights. I could sense in their eyes a reluctant respect, mingled with uncertainty about how to navigate this new dynamic. Emma blossomed in this healthier environment. The tension that had shadowed her for years began to lift, and I watched her grow more confident, her voice clearer at family dinners and school events alike. She no longer needed her tablet as a shield, but used it to connect and create, unburdened by the weight of silence that had once cloaked our household. Her laughter returned, bright and genuine, filling the spaces that had long felt hollow. Looking back, I realize how much this journey has reshaped not only my family, but myself. I discovered that respect is not given lightly. It is earned and protected. Boundaries, once seen as barriers, have become the framework for healthier love and understanding. And family, true family, is defined not by blood or tradition alone, but by kindness, honesty, and the courage to stand up for one another. The road ahead remains uncertain, with challenges yet to come. But for the first time in years, I feel a sense of peace rooted in strength and clarity. I am no longer just surviving. I am living, on my own terms, with Emma by my side, ready to face whatever the future holds, together.